The saloon was quiet, the way only a dying town gets quiet. Dust hung in the light that came through windows nobody had bothered to clean in months. The piano player had quit 3 weeks prior. What remained was the sound of men drinking alone and the occasional creak of a chair that had outlived its purpose. John Henry Holliday sat at the end of the bar with a glass of whiskey in his right hand. His left hand trembled, not slightly, not the kind of tremor a man can hide by keeping his drink close to his chest. This was the kind of shake that made the glass click against his teeth when he raised it, the kind that announced itself to anyone paying attention. And in that saloon, on that night, a man named Finley was paying attention. Finley had come to this town with a reputation. 3 men dead in Dodge City, 2 more in Abilene whose names people stopped saying because saying them made the town feel smaller. He walked into that saloon looking for something, and what he found was a thin man in a fine coat who looked like a strong breeze could take him. Finley made a comment, something about the coat being too nice for a man who could barely hold his drink. Holliday set the glass down, stood up. He was 5'9", 130 pounds maybe. His cheekbones cut through his face like something a sculptor had abandoned. His eyes were pale blue and they didn't blink the way normal eyes blink. Finley went for his gun. Holliday went for his. The accounts differ on who drew first. They do not differ on who fired first. Finley took the bullet somewhere between intention and action. Holliday lowered his weapon, sat back down, and asked the bartender for another. His left hand was still shaking. John Henry Holliday was born in 1851 in Macon, Georgia. His mother was a gentlewoman who taught him piano. His father was a dentist who expected his son to follow him into the business. The son did. Holliday studied at the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery. He graduated at 19. By 21, he had a practice in Atlanta that was doing well enough that people referred to him as Doc before anyone had called him anything else. Then the coughing started. Tuberculosis. The word itself was enough to empty a room in 1873. A bacterial infection that attacked the lungs and spread through the air, through shared breath, through the simple act of being near someone who was dying. It moved slowly. It gave you time to understand what was coming. That was its cruelty. Holliday was told he had 2 years. He left Georgia, left the practice, left the city that had begun to look at him the way people look at something that is already being remembered. He went west. The cough followed. The blood came. The years came too. More than the doctors had promised, though every one of them was paid for in breath. By 1879, he was in Dodge City, Kansas. And Dodge City was where John Hicks, the gambler who had taken the name Doc Holliday to escape his own past, became something else entirely. Gambling was the work. It paid the room, the train tickets, the whiskey that sometimes helped the cough feel less like drowning. But gambling required sitting still, and sitting still in a frontier town meant someone would eventually want what you had, or want you gone, or simply want to prove something to their friends. Holliday's first recorded gunfight was in 1875 in a town called Lincoln, New Mexico Territory. He killed a man named Charles Goodnight in a confrontation over a card game. The details are thin because the witnesses were either unwilling or unable to stay alive long enough to tell consistent stories. What followed was a chain of incidents that scholars have spent decades untangling. Not all of them involved Holliday drawing a weapon. Many involved threats, reputation, the slow accumulation of fear that precedes violence. Holliday understood that a gun was not always the answer. Sometimes the answer was simply the knowledge that one was there. He was not a large man. He was not a young man. He was a man with a chest full of disease and a right hand that could still clear leather faster than most men he met. Wyatt Earp walked into his life in 1877 in a town called Fort Griffin, Texas. Earp was a lawman in a time and place where the word meant everything and nothing, depending on which side of the gun you stood. He was a man of considerable physical presence, 6 feet tall, with a reputation for being both fair and utterly unmoved by intimidation. The 2 men met over a card table. What passed between them that night was not recorded in detail. What followed was a friendship that lasted 10 years. Holliday was not a lawman. He was never a deputy, never a marshal, never officially anything that would have made a courtroom comfortable. But when Wyatt Earp needed someone who would not flinch, who would stand in a line and not break, who understood that some problems required a different kind of solution than the law provided, Holliday stood in that line. Wyatt's brothers came after: Virgil, Morgan, Warren. Each one a different kind of man, each one drawn into the orbit of the oldest and the most stubborn. Tombstone, Arizona Territory, October 1881. The town had been founded 6 years earlier on a silver strike. By 1881, it had grown into something that looked like a city if you didn't look closely enough to see the tents behind the brick. The climate was dry and the water was scarce, and the men who had money were building houses, while the men who didn't were building resentment. The Earp brothers arrived in 1879 with money from a mining claim. Wyatt took a job as a deputy marshal. Virgil was appointed as a town marshal. Morgan worked alongside them. And Doc Holliday came because Wyatt was there, and because the climate, for all its harshness, was easier on a man's lungs than the damp of other places. The tension in Tombstone was not a single thing. It was a accumulation of things. The Clanton-McClory gang was a group of men who worked cattle and also worked robbery when the opportunity presented itself. They had history with the Earps, some of it ambiguous, some of it not, and they had friends in low places who made sure they always had warning before any law came looking. On October 26, 1881, a verbal confrontation occurred on the street near the Earp residence. The exact sequence of events has been debated by historians and contemporaries since the moment it ended. What is not debated is who fired first. Or rather, what is debated is whether firing first was murder or justice, depending entirely on which side of it you were standing. The gunfight at the OK Corral lasted approximately 30 seconds. Tom McClory was shot and killed. Frank McClory was shot and killed. Billy Clanton was shot and killed. Ike Clanton was wounded but survived. Virgil Earp was shot in the shoulder. Morgan Earp was shot in the hip. Wyatt Earp was grazed. Doc Holliday shot Tom McClory and possibly Frank McClory, depending on which account you prefer. The aftermath was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a longer and uglier war of attrition that would claim Morgan Earp's life 6 months later, wound Virgil permanently, and send Wyatt Earp into a decade of wandering that ended for him in San Diego and a kind of quiet that he had not expected to find. For Holliday, the fight was a continuation. He was already dying. The tuberculosis had progressed past the point where any doctor would give him a timeline. He was spending nights coughing blood into handkerchiefs that he burned rather than washed. He was taking morphine for the pain in his jaw, where the tuberculosis had spread to the point where eating was its own kind of agony. And he was still there, in that line, when the line needed him. Doc Holliday's documented kills are difficult to establish with certainty. This is not unusual for the time. Record-keeping was selective and often motivated by factors beyond accuracy. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that Holliday killed approximately 10 men over the course of his life, with the actual number potentially higher due to incidents that went unrecorded or were attributed to others in the confusion of frontier justice. The list includes, among others, Charles Goodnight, 1875, Tom McClory, 1881, Frank McClory, 1881, and possibly one additional combatant during the same altercation. There are earlier incidents attributed to him in various local accounts, but verification is complicated by the tendency of frontier communities to attribute unexplained deaths to whoever had the most notorious reputation. What is documented is not the body count, but the way he carried himself in the moments before violence. Multiple witnesses describe a transformation. The sickly man with the trembling hands would shift into something else entirely. It was not a change in physical appearance. It was a change in stillness. The tremor stopped. The pale eyes focused. The entire organism narrowed to a single purpose. And then, when it was over, the tremor returned. The tuberculosis spread. By 1882, Holliday was spending more time horizontal than vertical. The disease had moved beyond his lungs, into his spine, his jaw, his lymph nodes. The morphine doses increased. The whiskey increased. The doctors who had given him 2 years in 1873 were no longer making predictions. In 1884, Wyatt Earp brought him to a town called Gunnison, Colorado, in the hope that the mountain air might provide some relief. It did not. What it did was slow the progression enough that Holliday could spend his remaining years doing what he had always done, sitting at card tables, playing for small stakes, being in rooms where something might happen and being ready when it did. He could no longer sit for long periods. The pain in his jaw made eating impossible except in small quantities. He weighed under 100 pounds. His hair had gone entirely gray by the age of 35, but he was still Doc Holliday. In 1886, he made one final trip to Glenwood Springs, Colorado, where a physician named Dr. James B. Oakley had established a reputation for treating tuberculosis patients with a combination of climate therapy, dietary management, and something called thermal treatments that involved the natural hot springs in the area. It was not a cure. There was no cure. But it was an attempt, and on the frontier, an attempt was often all anyone had. He died on November 8, 1887. The tuberculosis had consumed him to the point where his body simply stopped. He was 36 years old. He weighed approximately 90 pounds. He died in bed. This detail matters because the stories told about Doc Holliday often tried to make his death match the shape of his life. They wanted something dramatic, something violent, something that would feel like an ending to a story that had been building for years. The truth is quieter. The truth is that a man who had been dying for 14 years finally stopped breathing in a rented room in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, with Wyatt Earp sitting beside him. Wyatt Earp was there. This part is not disputed. Two men who had stood together in the line when the line needed standing, at the end, in the quiet that comes after. The last words of Doc Holliday are, like most things about him, subject to competing accounts. The version most commonly cited was recorded by a nurse who was present in his final hours. She reported that as he was dying, Holliday turned to her and said, "This is funny." She asked what was funny. He said, "I think I'll be a dog." It is possible this is apocryphal. It is possible the nurse embellished. It is possible that a man who had spent his adult life running from death said something incomprehensible at the end, and the people who heard it tried to make it make sense afterward. What seems most likely is that a man who had been killing himself slowly for 14 years, who had watched his own body become a prison, who had chosen to spend his remaining time standing in lines and drawing guns and being useful to a friend who was also carrying something heavy. What seems most likely is that at the very end, he made a joke. Because that is what Doc Holliday was. Not a hero, not a villain. A man who had been given a death sentence and chosen to spend the time in motion. The nameless gunslinger knows something about that. A man who cannot run, who is bound to a body that is failing, who has been given a date on a calendar and told that is the end. That man still has a choice about what he does with the days between. Holliday chose to stay standing. He chose to be in the room when the line needed filling. He chose to sit at the table and play the hand he was dealt and bet everything on the moments that mattered. He chose, again and again, to draw the gun with a hand that was shaking and put it exactly where it needed to go. That is not a story about courage. Courage implies risk, implies the possibility of failure. Holliday knew he was going to die. The tuberculosis had decided that for him. What he did with the time that remained was not brave. It was operational. It was the cold mathematics of a man who understood exactly what his capabilities were and exactly what the situation required, and who delivered precisely that, every time, regardless of the cost. That is the part the stories miss. They tell you he was fast. They tell you he was sick. They tell you he was a dentist who became a gunfighter. But they do not tell you that what made him dangerous was not the gun. It was the precision. The absolute clinical certainty that when he drew that weapon, it was because drawing was the answer. And when it was done, he put the gun away and waited for the next time. The shaking hands were not a contradiction. They were the context. The desert reveals men. John Henry Holliday was revealed in 100 saloons across a territory that stretched from Georgia to Colorado, in card games and street confrontations, and one famous 30-second moment in Tombstone that has been replayed in memory and print ever since. He was revealed in a body that failed him from the age of 22. He was revealed in a friendship that lasted 10 years because two men understood each other without needing to explain. He was revealed in the way he kept choosing to be present for things that could have gone either way. The nameless gunslinger does not tell stories about men who are remembered. He tells stories about men who did the thing in front of them, with the time they had, with the body they were given. Doc Holliday would have understood that. He was, after all, one of the best. If this story sat with you, if you found yourself thinking about the shape of a man's life measured not against his death, but against what he chose to do between the diagnosis and the end, then subscribe. There are more stories like this one. From the borderland, from the time before the century turned, from men who learned early that the clock was running and decided to make noise while they could. Drop a comment. Tell me which part of Holliday's story stayed with you. The man who should have been dead in 2 years and lived for 14. The dentist who became a legend. The friend who was there at the end. I read every one.